Welcome back to the podcast. Welcome back to Theory and Theology. Got another cultural/religion topic for you today. Okay, so I'm not doing like a formal comparison of Christianity and paganism. Just kind of very vague general stuff that kind of just I was thinking on a little bit here and there. One thing is kind of like history timelines. Paganism is older than Christianity. The pagans were already there. There were forms and styles of people doing different worship practices even before Judaism was officially kind of more established. I feel like the complex part about Judaism is that it traces back to, according to the Bible, to Adam and Eve, tracing a lineage and ancestry back to those humans that were created initially. And then by the time you have Cain and Abel, still in Genesis, at the first book of the Bible, you already have a situation where Cain and Abel are both giving offerings to God. So they're already practicing a form of religion. And so those were the kids of Adam and Eve. And so it doesn't really say what Adam and Eve practiced. I mean, they were talking in Genesis directly to God as God was walking physically in the garden. They had interactions with all sorts of supernatural things going on, from the serpent who kind of trapped them into a form of deception to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And also there's some mention of certain types of angels guarding the Garden of Eden after Adam and Eve had been banished. And the first, like, before they got banished, the first sacrifice was made by God. I'm assuming God killed an animal, sacrificed it, and then used those skins to fashion clothing for Adam and Eve. Now, they had already fashioned themselves, they were already hiding because they were naked. I don't remember if they fashioned for themselves clothing of like leaves. I'd have to go back. But yeah, so the first sacrifice was by God. The next time you hear about any kind of sacrificing is Cain and Abel. Actually, you hear about offerings. I'm assuming the offering was going to lead to sacrifice, but you hear Cain and Abel, Abel's offering was considered better, and through traditional, story, Abel gave his flock, and Cain gave of his fruits of his harvest. and that Abel's offering was more acceptable to God. So there was some form of seemingly direct communication in with Adam and Eve and God, and then some other form of direct communication with Cain and Abel and God. But the further you keep going in the book of Genesis, you don't really see this direct communication as deeply. By the time you get to Noah, before the flood, it seems like there was all kind of wickedness going on. The Nephilim, were having things going on, like some kind of beings that, were interacting with human women to create another type of person or being of some form. So you see that, and you see, you see Noah and his family with all these animals going into the ark, and supposedly from that point on, everybody was wiped out from the land other than these direct relatives and in-laws, for 40 days and 40 nights, and then they repopulated the earth. So by the time you get to Exodus, where like throughout the story of Moses, by the time you get to Exodus, you have Moses young, in his 40s probably, leading the people out of Egypt. And they wandered around the desert for 40 years. It's like a whole generation of people almost. So there were a lot of newborns that, probably from 40 years, that by the time they were 40 years old, they were finally settled. So other people would have been older than that by that point. And people back then were living so long anyways. I think Moses lived to be like 120 or something. So I guess 40 years really isn't that much. It's like a third of your life. So you'd probably be like close to what might be considered your 30s now, 20s, 30s now. You still wouldn't be worrying about like old age and stuff like that. So that period, by the time you're in Exodus, where the Hebrews were in Egypt, you already have other people doing other stuff. Now, I haven't studied the origins of other religions, but Judaism kind of traces itself back. There's a lot of different indigenous groups who have religious and traditional beliefs that trace themselves back to the beginning, to their origin. So that's the part where I get a little confused. It's like, okay, if these were the only people, then how were there all these other versions of different people from a specific culture? Maybe that's not literal. Maybe it's just figuratively. There was some created beings that eventually led into us being here. But it does seem like there's a lot of weird missing information, at least from the history I've studied. Because if you think about like Hinduism, there's not like Adam and Eve. If you think about Buddhism, you think about these other religions. If you see Judaism as being traced back to Adam and Eve, that's different than seeing Judaism as starting with Moses and the Israelites in the desert after they had fled from Egypt. That's a different people. And I think I mentioned before that while they were in the desert, they were making a golden calf, and they had some other idea of some other type of religion that they probably had been exposed to in Egypt, that maybe that was an Egyptian religion, maybe it was something else. I don't really know. I'd like to know why they decided to fashion this thing. They seem to know what they were doing. It didn't seem like it was a random act. It seemed like they were doing it as another form of worship to something that wasn't the God of the Bible. And they were reprimanded by it. And then so once Moses was given the commandments, and then all the commandments you see like during Exodus, there's just all these different measurements for all this different stuff, and all the different ways that everybody's supposed to be sacrificing all this stuff and doing all these things and building the tents and like all this kind of stuff, like the worship tents, like temple basically, but it was like movable, portable. It just seemed like a lot, altars, everything. Like it just seemed like so much was happening in the book of Exodus. There was a lot going on. And I don't really know the math of the genealogy, but this is quite a long time into human history by this point. So that version of God at Mount Sinai talking to Moses, only showing the back of himself to Moses, that's a different God characteristic or personality than what you see in the Garden of Eden, and then comparing that to what you see in with Cain and Abel. But there was some form of worship going on before, but it seemed like it was mostly giving offerings, sacrificing, just kind of similar to what was happening in the Garden of Eden. But I don't really know how that turned into all these other things. So with paganism, the reason why I was kind of mentioning that is because, this is a different history. And, the reason why I talk about Judaism is because, Jesus was Jewish, and Christianity sprang out of, Jesus' life. And once he was actually on the earth, there was no Christianity before Jesus. There were other types of Judaism, like different types of beliefs of Judaism. There was a rabbi who was there, I think Hillel was there before Jesus. There was Josephus, who was around, he was a Jewish historian around during the time of Jesus. But yeah, Hillel, according to one scholar, Hillel is a rabbi that was Pharisaic and studied by Jesus. They say that a lot of the things that Jesus quoted or spoke of was from Hillel. And so that's interesting. And sorry, I lost my train of thought. And the sirens distracted me. So basically, yeah, Jesus and Hillel. And then, Jesus dies. So from the point of Jesus dying, Christians were still within Judaism for the most part, like worshiping in the same places. You don't see until is it Antiochus Epiphanes, or is that someone else? The Roman ruler that was the one who combined, Christianity with paganism. So before that, during the Council of Nicaea, that's when the Christians were kicked out from the synagogues and were no longer considered a form of Judaism. And the Christians kind of went on a different path and started converting people to Christianity. I think there was some converting before that, but ultimately, they were Jews, and then when Jesus was around, they were kind of like, he was kind of talking to people who were not always Jewish, and a lot of them were starting to follow him too. I mean, if the Bible says Gentiles, I don't know what group specifically those are, because it would have been any group that wasn't Jewish people. And so he was preaching to them as well as to Jews. And then there was more active, there's a more active conversion process with, if you read about like what Paul was doing and where he traveled, and all these other apostles, they were all over the place. Like, they literally were all over the place. They did so much traveling. It's very interesting to see the places where they went, like where they went on the map. You're like, wow, these people did all this, and they weren't on planes or anything like that. It's like, so they were going around, teaching to these different groups of people. Now, if you start studying the different groups of people that the Jews were talking to, none of these were necessarily, I don't want to say none, but like, they weren't necessarily talking to Jews. They were talking to all these different cultures. They were talking to Greeks. They went to Turkey, and you see them in like all these other like countries. And they're all over the place, and you see them talking to all sorts of people. Like, it's interesting to look in history at the map of certain people, like where they were doing certain stuff, and you're like, wow, like, you're over here, you're over there. They definitely were traveling, and I'm not 100% certain of all these different types of groups. Like, I don't really know who these people were. I don't know their culture. What were they doing before Christianity came in there? What were they actually like up to? And before people were getting baptized and everything. And so you start seeing Christianity spreading all over. And there were pagan groups that were approached as well. And so I don't really know if there are different types of paganism. Like, I feel like the one that I'm learning about is called Norse paganism. But I'm not sure if like maybe what the Chaldeans were doing, was that considered paganism, like with the Asherah and all those things. Is that paganism? I don't really know. Like, I don't really know exactly what the word means. I should probably look it up. But I mean, it's like, if they're worshiping multiple gods, that's a lot of different types of religions, but I don't know if they have the same gods necessarily. Like, they have different gods. And so it just does seem like there are, at least back then, there were a lot more religions that were worshiping other things, multiple other things, or even some religions that had like, one god. But there were a lot of religions that had multiple gods. A lot of it being like attached to nature and things like that, and just like life circumstances. But man, I'm getting all these work messages. I don't even know who some of these people are. Man, a lot of people are going on PTO. Anyways, so you would have that would be something to look into, you know, other than the Bible, you know, trails of where, you know, people were traveling to convert people to Christianity, teach them about Christianity. Other than that, you know, you see a lot of people converting, but you still do see, you know, other stuff. There's just so much diversity in the Bible, and you see a lot of like in the Bible you don't see really any other than people that were getting converted from paganism to Judaism or Christianity. Like there is some way back, you know, where people, I think, where there were some people who came into Judaism, there were some people who came into Christianity, but you know, the paganism didn't start getting really incorporated back then, other than, you know, I mean, maybe people were coming from it, so they knew of it, so that's why they were doing all these other things, like, sometimes, but there wasn't, like, the modern day version of, like, you know, Easter and Christmas and all that kind of stuff. I'm not saying, you know, anything wrong with it or whatever. I'm just saying, in the Bible, that wasn't happening. They were still living mostly a Jewish type of life, if not a pretty strictly Jewish life. You know, the kind of more, not lenient, but kind of like the version after the Christians split from Judaism after the Council of Nicaea, that version of Christianity where, you know, there didn't have to be like circumcision at a certain point, just different things like that, where it was like deterring people from wanting to join. Like, what adult person wants to get circumcised, right? Like, that doesn't sound like something that most people like look forward to. And so something I was noticing when, you know, those apostles were starting to talk about you know, these different kinds of rules for the non-Jewish Christians, there was like a little bit of a difference if you kind of like follow the story of early Christianity. So it seems like there was a difference between the people who might have been pagan or other types of belief systems who were converting into Christianity. Those people didn't have necessarily the same rules as the Jewish Christians did, but somewhere along the line it appears that the Jewish Christians no longer were following the, you know, Jewish ways, and as more and more people started to convert, eventually, once that Roman ruler declared like certain types of feast days as you know, similar to the pagan days, and the solar calendar, basically the Gregorian calendar, the solar calendar is basically different from the lunar calendar. So the Jewish calendar goes by the lunar calendar. So when you're looking at holidays, a lot of the time, the original Jewish holidays are set festival times around the lunar cycle. That's why a lot of times the dates are different than what they are compared to the calendar that we're using in Western American society, because we go by a different calendar and they have different months, names of different months, and the year is different. Like, according to the Jewish calendar, the year is in the 5000s or something. And then there's also, yeah, so basically it changes based on the lunar pattern. And then you have the pagan days that were already on the solar calendar. So they kind of coincide a little bit. There's a little bit of stuff happening, but you know, even the days like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, all of the days, as well as you know, so if you start from I don't know what the first holiday would be, but I guess, I mean, the major ones tend to be at the end of the year, but there's also Easter that's like April-ish, and then there's basically what, like Halloween, Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year. Pretty much all of that is towards the end of the year for the most part, all of those major kind of holidays. Now on the lunar calendar you have days like, I think I recently talked about Sukkot and Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah. A lot of that has to do with the lunar cycle, the moon. As you know, we're coming into fall, but there's always this kind of like harvest theme of like harvest, right? Around, you know, September, October time, there's always this harvest kind of theme, and then November as well, this kind of like harvest kind of theme, going into winter where, you know, you have you know, Christmas. That's why I'm kind of guessing Christmas wasn't, I mean, of course they say, yeah, Jesus' birthday, but most people know that, you know, historically Jesus wasn't born near December time, but it's like also from a culture where they're not really celebrating like birthdays. Like, you don't have like Moses' birthday and Aaron's birthday and Noah's birthday. Like, you don't have like birthdays like that in the Bible. So birthdays aren't really like something that was necessarily being celebrated, other than it seems like by kings. You weren't really celebrating birthdays like that in that culture. But you know, Christmas kind of was made, and Hanukkah happens to be nearby that time, but Hanukkah is kind of newer in the Bible, during the Maccabean revolt. But during Jesus' time, Hanukkah existed, but it didn't exist like earlier during like Noah's and Moses' time. Like, Hanukkah wasn't like a thing, but it is part of Jewish history and did become one of the feast days of Judaism. I don't know if there are any Jewish groups that don't observe Hanukkah. But yeah, it's just interesting how there's all these holidays and all these kind of different traditional paths, and now so basically it looks like the story overall goes, like Judaism with paganism, they're kind of having some parallel kind of route somewhere along the line, and then Christianity kind of pops in. Christianity takes a turn out of Judaism and comes into paganism, and gets basically absorbed by paganism, with the main belief systems being around, the Jewish Jesus as the Messiah and God, the Son of God and God. And then you have you have yeah, so then you have that going full circle back into, once the pagans started getting converted, and then that newer Christian type of tradition started becoming more looking like pagan and less looking like Judaism, and to the point now where you can't really distinguish the two. I mean, you can distinguish the two completely. You wouldn't be able to really notice that, oh, this seems like it came from Judaism. Like, there's almost nothing that would seem like it does, honestly, because everything's different. Even from the days where people will go to temple or go to church or whatever, it's like no longer the Jewish Sabbath, it's now Sunday, which is fine. I mean, I'm not like knocking any of it. I really couldn't care less what day people want to do what. And yeah, I think it's good to celebrate stuff, in my opinion. Celebrate whatever you want to celebrate, worship whoever you want to worship, however you want to do it. Like, I'm not here to tell anybody don't do it, but it's just kind of interesting that I'm sure I'm not the only one, but I was raised like in a church, and I just found it interesting that all the church I went through, the more you kind of dig into this type of history of stuff, of why, I was always reading the Bible and reading, about like what Jesus was doing, and I was like, why is none of this like an issue? Like, there'd be holidays that were mentioned that we're never like doing, and all this other stuff, where I was like, well, why aren't we doing this? And why don't we do that? And why aren't we doing this? And why aren't we doing that? And it's kind of like, I'd always see all these different things that like the Jewish people were doing, especially because I read a lot of the Old Testament too. And I was like, well, why aren't we doing any of this stuff? It would have all these, like, all the 10 commandments in Exodus, and then it had all these other like chapter after chapter of commandments of other stuff to do that like nobody in Christianity was doing, a bunch of stuff in Leviticus that nobody was doing, in Deuteronomy that nobody was doing. I was like, why is nobody doing any of this stuff? And then I looked around and I saw, okay, in Judaism there's still these types of practices in a lot of ways, and then other than like the sacrificing type of stuff, and then you don't really see it at all in Christianity, like at all in modern day. And so I was always curious as to why, and I'm like, these people went to school forever. Like, they got at least master's degrees, and they went to school for a very long time and know the biblical history. So I always just found it interesting that they never would answer or never would teach about, the history of it all. Like, I was kind of like weirded out by that all the time, that like you just kind of learn not to ask, even though they might have the answers. It's like, well, I'd always kind of see these little things like that where I was like, oh, like, that's interesting, like, why is it like that? So now I kind of realize more, when I spend time studying more into it, like all these kind of overlapping cultures that were going on. Like, when we read the Bible today, it almost seems like we're reading it through the eyes of, our modern day, like, Christian traditions that the churches have, but the modern day Christian traditions they didn't even exist back then when Jesus was like on the earth. And so, and just even how, the connection of God being like on earth and like showing himself in full, versus all the way until like in portions and like signs and things, to being like, now it's like you don't really hear people say that kind of stuff, like I saw God, or saw this. Like, you don't really hear people saying that kind of stuff. But back then, it seems like there was a lot more closeness and proximity, and where that stopped or how that changed is I don't really know where to go with that, because I don't really have answers about that, or I never really thought to even really ask too much questions about it. But it's definitely different if you just even track how God was at the very beginning, in creation, and so close to people, and then now it's like, what happened? Like, I don't know if it was supposed to be that way or not, but it's like just interesting. And it's interesting how religion developed from just a simple, like, okay, sacrifice and give offerings, to a completely organized religion. Like, when the Israelites came out of the desert, it was definitely organized religion, with all these laws and commandments and all these kind of things that that wasn't really how the Jews before Egypt were actually doing things. So yeah, it's just pretty interesting. I don't really know. I mean, I'm enjoying this kind of like Norse pagan studying that I'm doing. It's very interesting. I don't think I'm ever gonna get to a point where I can like put a bunch of pieces together. And I'm kind of almost disappointed that my exposure to paganism is through being raised through a strict Christian background. I kind of wish that wasn't the truth, because I think it makes it really hard to understand, because there's so much stigma and so much pressure surrounding the idea of like rejecting it, even more so than how Christianity overall usually teaches traditionally to reject things like yoga and meditation. Like, that's not uncommon for people to say, like, don't do that, don't meditate, don't do all, like, don't do there's certain types of stuff that are considered, maybe don't deal with it, like psychics and those types of that type of stuff. I mean, I'm just saying that's traditionally what you would hear most. I think maybe not even most, but I'd say, like, especially of the stricter bunches, you usually hear that message, don't go over there, don't get exposed to that, it's evil, it's wrong, it's bad. And so you hear that a lot with definitely with paganism, and I think almost of all the religions, that's one of the religions that is just taught like that's not really how you're gonna need to do things. Like, you really shouldn't do things that look like that. But then also, I find it kind of interesting that it's like, okay, don't learn about paganism, don't do anything related to paganism, but then we have all these holidays that are pagan holidays, and worshiping on the weekly pagan worship day, and all these other things. So it's kind of like, stay away, but don't stay away, or like, if you are gonna do it, just call it something else. I mean, that's kind of the message I get. I don't really know, maybe I don't know. I'm not trying to like have people hate me, but I'm just saying, like, it's kind of like weird. Like, it's just, I just wish that it wasn't such a confusing kind of a message to get from, a religion to both do and don't get connected with this. Because it's like, if you want to not connect to paganism and then you start doing a lot of the like Jewish holy days, like say if you join, like I remember when I was attending like a Messianic Jewish congregation, my Christian friends and family were just like, what are you doing? Like, but I'm like, they believe in Jesus, they just follow the Bible, Old and New Testament, and so they do a lot of the stuff that was being done before, Christianity adopted a lot of pagan traditions and beliefs. And that, for some reason, in Christianity, in modern day Christianity, is frowned upon. It's like, oh, that's Jewish and it looks foreign, and there's just this whole like, why are you doing all these other things? And then there's the other side that's like, but don't be pagan, but do all the pagan stuff, but still be Christian. So I just found that weird. It's like, be Christian with the paganism, don't be Christian with the Judaism. So I don't know. It's interesting how I guess one is favored and looked more highly upon over the other. And what I'm finding from studying about Norse paganism, at least, I don't know all the other types of paganism, but from Norse paganism at least, it just sounds like a beautiful, religion. There's a lot of stuff that reminds me of, I used to be big into fantasy books, sci-fi and fantasy, but, fantasy, a lot of these like ancient Scandinavian and different types of groups like that. It just looks like, a lot of themes you would see out of like Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter and what do you call it? Like Game of Thrones and like all these types of ideas, all these types of I don't want to call it like fake stuff, but you see it a lot in the media. I think that's the majority of my exposure is usually through the media, but I've never really taken my mind to another step to say like, oh, like this is actually like these terminologies and some of this stuff. Like, I know it's not like the actual religion, it's not actually the pagan religion, but it's like all these ideas about like elves and runes and the old gods and all this kind of terminology, and like beliefs and the rituals with the fires and the horns and the drums and the the gods that are carved and all these different like altars and things like that. Like, it's just it's not very similar to things you see in Christianity at all. But then we have a lot of the symbolism, like if you think about like Christmas trees and Easter bunnies and Easter eggs and even like Halloween with the all the things that happen around Halloween time. It's just a very interesting kind of beautiful mixture of cultures that I just like to step back and just look at it honestly and just look at it for what it is and be like, wow, like it's fun to see kind of how like even religion evolves. It's like, you can see how religion was, and then how there are traditions that people still hold to, but you can kind of track and see like, oh, like when this happened, that happened, and now everything looks so different than it used to, and then there's always this kind of like hold on to the original oldest things, and then there's this kind of like modern day like version of like people are just doing all these other things that just fit with the here and the now. Like something, for example, that's interesting, I mean, I'm not judging it or anything, but something that's interesting is say you go to a church where they're doing communion and they have that little pre-packaged little cup of, usually it's like grape juice and then a little wafer attached to the top of the cup, and it's like a manufactured, communion. You have like a holy communion in a little packet, and it's kind of cute. It's kind of, I don't know if it's okay to call it cute or not, but I think it's kind of really nice. But like, you wouldn't have something like that's not like a traditional thing. It's kind of like a modern invention of something that people do as a ritual, but it's like, it's already prepackaged, ready to go. Just hand them out to everybody in the congregation and let's get this communion going. It's like, it's so different. It's so different from like, I don't know. It's just really different. But I like it too. I think it's beautiful. It's just fun to have like modern technology involved in like church and religious services, and then there's ancient parchments that are like written by hand on like certain types of skin with certain types of ink, and like it's like all this stuff happening kind of simultaneously. It's pretty cool to see. But I'm going like way on a whole tangent, but that's, I don't know, I get pretty like happy about it. It just, I don't know, I like to find a lot of joy in this stuff, even though maybe I sound pretty serious, but it's hard for me to like think and sound like fun. Like when I'm really thinking, I'm just very monotone and very just like boring and dull. Just trying to think about facts, or at least what I've studied, and like reference what I've studied. But I don't know if you guys prefer me to give more exact references. A lot of this stuff I get from, the internet, or just reading, and just like when a certain name comes up, or a certain topic comes up, or term that I don't really know, like, I'll look it up from multiple different sources and see kind of what that source says about that thing. And then, I'll basically do that till I get tired of doing it. But yeah. Alright guys, I'm gonna stop this recording because it's getting ridiculously long, but thanks for listening.